The desert air at 4 in the morning was a sharp, physical presence, tasting of ancient dust and the promise of a cold sunrise. I pulled my jacket tighter, the nylon fabric making a rhythmic scritch-scratch sound that was the only thing anchoring me to the ground. Around me, the launch field in Sedona was a hive of controlled chaos. The roar of industrial fans, the staccato bursts of flame from the burners, and the low murmurs of ground crews. I stood at the edge of the perimeter, clutching my camera bag like a shield. I had paid 3 times the standard rate for this experience, a private hot air balloon tour. No small talk. No strangers encroaching on my oxygen. No need to manage the expectations of another human being while I tried to breathe in the vastness of the Arizona sky. For a freelance botanical illustrator like me, life was built on the meticulous observation of things that didn't talk back. Flowers stayed still. Plants didn't ask you why you were so quiet or tell you to just relax. Miss, there's been a slight complication with the manifest. The voice of the flight coordinator made my stomach drop. It was that familiar, sinking sensation, the feeling that the world was about to demand something from me that I hadn't prepared for. I didn't look him in the eye. Instead, I focused on the clipboard he held, noting the way the corners of the paper were slightly frayed and stained with coffee. I booked the private tour, I said, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. I hated how my throat constricted when I had to assert myself. I have the confirmation right here on my phone. I know, and we're incredibly sorry, he said, shifting his weight. A glitch in the new booking software overwritten several slots. Your pilot is ready, but we've had to pair you with another solo traveler who is also double booked. It's either a shared basket or we reschedule you for 3 days from now. 3 days. I was leaving in 2. My hands began to sweat inside my pockets. I looked toward the basket, a sturdy, woven wicker box that suddenly felt like a cage. To share that small space with a stranger felt like an insurmountable task. My mind immediately began to spin a web of worst-case scenarios. She would be a vlogger who would narrate every second for her followers. She would be someone who felt the need to fill every silence with inanities about the vibe. There she is, the coordinator said, gesturing toward a figure walking toward us from the parking lot. She was wearing a bright yellow windbreaker that seemed to defy the dim light of dawn. Her hair was pulled back in a practical, messy knot, and she walked with a bounce that made my teeth ache. She looked like sunlight personified, the kind of person who would expect me to be her best friend by the time we hit 500 feet. I felt a surge of irrational resentment. I was convinced she was a plant, someone the company had placed there to save their bottom line, a professional, happy person, to mask their systemic failure. Hi, I'm Angela, she said as she reached us. Her voice was melodic, carried by a confidence that felt like an intrusion. She extended a hand, and I stared at it for a heartbeat too long before giving a limp, quick shake. Chloe, I muttered, my gaze returning to the safety of the dirt at my feet. Looks like we're sky buddies today, Angela said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. I hope you don't mind. I'm a bit of a space hog when it comes to taking photos, but I promise to stay on my side of the wicker. I forced a tight, artificial smile. My internal monologue was a storm of judgment. I watched her check her phone, her movements fluid and unbothered, and I felt smaller, more brittle. I was certain she would spend the next hour talking over the sound of the wind, shattering the one moment of peace I had traveled 1,000 miles to find. I gripped my camera strap, the leather digging into my palm, and prepared for a journey that already felt like a claustrophobic mistake. The process of boarding the basket was an exercise in forced intimacy. The pilot, a weathered man with skin like cracked leather, gave us a brief safety demonstration that I barely heard over the thumping of my own heart. I climbed in first, scurrying to the far corner, positioning my camera bag as a literal boundary between my space and the rest of the world. Angela followed, her movements surprisingly efficient. She didn't fumble or hesitate. She stood on the opposite side, but even so, the basket felt too small. The scent of her, something like citrus and laundry detergent, cut through the heavy smell of propane. It was an aggressive cleanliness that made my own dusty hiking boots feel out of place. First time? She asked, her voice low. Yes, I replied, not looking up. I made a show of adjusting my lens, hoping the busy signal would be enough to deter her. It's breathtaking once you get up there, she continued, undeterred. The way the light hits the red rocks, it's like the earth is waking up just for you. I've traveled a lot, but this place has a specific kind of magic. I nodded curtly. I didn't want her magic. I wanted the silence I had paid for. I felt a simmer of anger toward the booking office, but it was redirected toward her. Why couldn't she see that I was vibrating with discomfort? Why did people like her always assume that silence was a void they were obligated to fill? I convinced myself she was performative, probably rehearsing lines for a social media post she'd craft later. I imagined the caption, "Found a shy new friend in the clouds. Hashtag solo travel hashtag connection." The thought made my skin crawl. The burner roared, a deafening, bone-shaking blast of heat that made me flinch. We lifted off with a gentle, deceptive smoothness. The ground receded, the people below becoming miniatures, then ants, then specks. The silence that followed the burner's blast was profound, yet it was ruined by the weight of her presence. I stared fixedly at the horizon, refusing to turn my head even an inch toward her. "You're shaking," Angela said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a simple observation. "I'm fine," I snapped, my voice harsher than intended. "It's just cold." "It is," she agreed, her tone remarkably level. "The temperature drops fast when you gain altitude." I expected her to keep talking, to offer some unsolicited advice on breathing or being present. Instead, she did something I didn't anticipate. She reached into her own bag, pulled out a thick, oversized wool shawl, and held it out toward me.
"Take it," she said.
"I have my jacket. I brought this specifically for the chill, but I'm warmer than I expected." I looked at the fabric, a deep charcoal gray, heavy and soft. I didn't want to take anything from her. Taking it meant acknowledging her kindness, which meant my resentment would have nowhere to live. But my teeth were actually chattering now, and the wind was picking up. I hesitated, my hand hovering in the air. "I don't want to deprive you," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "You aren't," she said, and for the first time, she wasn't smiling. Her expression was neutral, her eyes steady. She simply draped the shawl over my shoulders and stepped back to her side of the basket. She didn't wait for a thank you. She turned her back to me and began looking out at the horizon, leaving me alone in the warmth of her offering. The shawl smelled of faint lavender and something metallic, like old keys. It was surprisingly heavy, the kind of weight that felt like an anchor. As we drifted higher, the sun finally broke over the edge of the world, spilling liquid gold across the canyon floor. The red rocks glowed, as if they were being lit from within. For a few minutes, the beauty was so overwhelming that I forgot to be afraid. I forgot to be angry. I stole a glance at Angela. She wasn't taking pictures. She wasn't on her phone. She was just standing there, her hands resting lightly on the wicker edge, her gaze fixed on the horizon with an intensity that seemed almost professional. She wasn't the vlogger I had imagined. There was a stillness in her now that mirrored the vastness around us. Then the air changed. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was a sudden, violent shove. A mountain wave, a powerful atmospheric current, hit the balloon with the force of a physical blow. The basket lurched, tilting at a terrifying angle. I lost my footing, my knees hitting the floor with a painful thud. My camera bag slid toward the edge, and I lunged for it, my heart leaping into my throat. "Stay down," the pilot yelled, his voice strained. He pulled the burner trigger, but instead of the usual roar, there was a sickening, high-pitched hiss. A sharp, acrid smell of raw propane filled the small space. I looked up and saw the pilot's face. The tan had drained away, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He was fumbling with the fuel lines, his hands shaking. "The pressure valve," Angela shouted. She didn't sound like the sunny tourist anymore. Her voice was sharp, authoritative, and stripped of all its melodic softness. I was paralyzed. I was back in my childhood bedroom, watching the walls shake during the earthquake that had defined my early fears, the total loss of control, the feeling that the floor was a lie. I curled into a ball in the corner, clutching the charcoal shawl as if it could save me. The basket swung wildly again, and I felt myself sliding toward the open air. In an instant, Angela was there. She didn't scream.
She didn't panic.
She threw her entire body weight against me, pinning me into the corner of the basket, using her own frame as a barrier between me and the shifting floor. "Breathe, Chloe," she commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. "Hold on to the internal frame. Don't let go." She reached over me, her arm corded with muscle I hadn't noticed before, and grabbed the safety tether that had come loose from my harness. With a practiced flick of her wrist, she snapped it back into the ring on the floor. "I've got you," she whispered, though her eyes were already back on the pilot. "Stay low. Don't move." She then did something that defied everything I thought I knew about her. She stood up into the wind, bracing her legs against the wicker, and moved toward the pilot. She didn't ask if he needed help. She saw that he was in shock. "Move aside," she told him. "I'm a certified co-pilot with Maverick Aviation. I've handled a pressure leak on this model before. Give me the wrench." I watched from the floor, my face pressed against the rough wicker, as the woman I had dismissed as a socialite took command of our survival. The pilot, dazed and struggling with the bucking basket, stepped back as Angela lunged for the overhead assembly. The hiss of the gas was deafening now, a predatory sound that promised a cold, fast fall. Angela's movements were a blur of calculated precision. She wasn't looking at the view anymore. She was looking at the guts of the machine. She reached into the tangle of hoses, her fingers moving with a grace that was entirely different from the bouncy walk she'd had on the ground. She was speaking to the pilot in a low, rapid-fire shorthand, technical terms I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. She was the one in charge. "The secondary bypass is jammed," she shouted over the wind. "I need to manual vent the redundant line, or we're going to lose lift entirely." The pilot nodded, finally snapping out of his stupor. He grabbed the handling lines to stabilize our descent while Angela worked. She was leaning out over the edge of the basket, one hand white-knuckled on the frame, the other buried in the burner assembly. A gust of wind caught the balloon, sending us into another sickening tilt. I screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the air. Angela didn't even flinch. She stayed focused on the valve. I saw a flash of silver, a small multi-tool she'd pulled from her pocket. With a sharp, guttural grunt, she twisted something. The high-pitched hiss stopped instantly, replaced by the familiar, healthy roar of the burner as the pilot triggered the flame. We stabilized. The violent swinging subsided into a heavy, rhythmic swaying. We were descending fast, too fast for a normal landing, but we were no longer falling out of the sky. "Brace for impact," Angela yelled, turning back to me. She didn't go back to her side of the basket. She dived back into the corner with me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders and pulling my head into her chest. "Tuck your chin, Chloe. Legs bent.
Now."
I did exactly what she said. I buried my face in that charcoal shawl, the scent of lavender now mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of propane. I felt the tension in her body, a coiled spring of pure intent. The impact was brutal. The basket hit the desert floor with a bone-jarring crunch, tipped over, and dragged for 20 feet through the scrub brush and sand before the collapsing fabric of the balloon finally brought us to a halt. Silence rushed back in, heavy and thick. I stayed tucked against her for a long time, my eyes squeezed shut. I was waiting for the pain, for the sound of something breaking, but all I heard was the sound of Angela's breathing. Fast, ragged, but steady. "We're down," she whispered. Her hand was on the back of my head, a firm, grounding pressure. "We're on the ground, Chloe. You can open your eyes." I pulled back slowly. We were tilted sideways, the basket half buried in a sand dune. Angela's face was inches from mine. She had a long scratch across her cheek where a branch had whipped her, and her yellow windbreaker was torn at the shoulder. She looked exhausted, her sunny persona completely stripped away, leaving behind a woman who looked like she had just gone to war with the sky and won. "You saved us," I said, my voice cracking. She gave a small, weary smile and reached out to brush a stray hair from my forehead. "We saved us. You didn't jump out, and you followed the brace instructions perfectly. That's half the battle." The rescue crews arrived 40 minutes later. They were a whirlwind of radios, thermal blankets, and concerned questions. The pilot was being treated for mild shock, and the flight coordinator from the field, the one who had told me about the glitch, was white-faced as he helped us out of the tilted basket. I sat on the bumper of a Range Rover, wrapped in a foil emergency blanket that crinkled with every breath. My camera was safe, but I didn't care about it. My hands were finally still, though my mind was racing. I watched Angela standing a few yards away, talking to a group of men in official uniforms. She was pointing at the burner assembly, her gestures sharp and technical. They were listening to her with a level of respect that bordered on deference. "She's a ringer," a voice said beside me. It was the flight coordinator. He looked like he wanted to vomit. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Angela. She's not just a solo traveler. She's one of the best young pilots in the state. Her father owns the biggest aviation firm in the Southwest. She was supposed to be subbing for our regular pilot today, a favor for a friend, but there was a paperwork issue with her local certification for this specific county. She decided to ride along as a passenger to check the equipment because she'd heard rumors about this balloon's maintenance. I felt a cold flush of shame. The glitch wasn't a glitch. She had likely pushed her way onto the flight because she suspected the equipment was faulty. She wasn't an intruder. She was a guardian. And I had spent the entire morning treating her like a nuisance. I had judged her for her clothes, her voice, her energy. All the things she used to mask the crushing responsibility she carried. I stood up, the foil blanket falling from my shoulders. I walked toward her, my heart hammering against my ribs. She saw me approaching and stepped away from the officials, her expression softening. "Chloe, you okay?" "The medic said you're clear, but shock can take a while to—" "I'm so sorry," I interrupted, the words tumbling out. I was horrible to you. In my head, I mean. I thought you were just some loud tourist who wanted to ruin my peace. I thought you were fake. I didn't even want to take your shawl." I looked down at the charcoal wool I was still clutching. I felt like a child. Angela laughed, but it wasn't the bright, performative laugh from the field. It was low and a little sad. "Chloe, I get it. Honestly. I'm loud because if I'm not, I have to listen to the sound of people telling me I'm only a pilot because of my dad. I play the part of the happy tourist because the reality, the pressure of keeping people safe in the air, is a lot to carry. Sometimes, I just want to be the girl in the yellow jacket who doesn't know how a pressure valve works." She looked at the scratch on her cheek. "I knew this balloon was a mess. I didn't want anyone else in that basket today, but when I saw you, you looked so fragile, yet so determined to have your moment. I figured if I couldn't stop the flight, the least I could do was be the one holding the wrench if things went south." I reached out, my hand hovering before I gently touched her arm. It was the first time I had initiated contact. "Thank you, not just for the valve, for the shawl, for everything." "Forget about it," she said, though she didn't pull away. "But hey, if you're still looking for that peace and quiet you paid for, I know a spot on the ground that's much safer than a basket. No propane required." The rest of the morning was a blur of statements and adrenaline depletion. By 2 in the afternoon, I was back in the historic district of Sedona, wandering through the narrow, cobblestoned alleys. My body felt heavy, as if the gravity of the earth was trying to make up for our brush with the sky. I was looking for a specific botanical garden I had read about, a place of silent succulents and ancient cacti, but my mind kept drifting back to the smell of propane and the weight of Angela's arms around me. I turned a corner near a small, sun-drenched cafe and stopped dead. There she was. Angela was sitting at a small wrought iron table, a cup of dark coffee in front of her. She had changed into a simple black t-shirt, and she put a small adhesive bandage over the scratch on her cheek. She was staring at a map, her brow furrowed in concentration. I hesitated. My instinct was to duck into a shop, to preserve my solitude. But the memory of the morning, the way she had anchored me, overrode my social tremors. I walked toward her. "The map won't tell you where the best prickly pears are," I said softly. She looked up, startled, and then a genuine, wide smile broke across her face. "Chloe, of all the alleys in Sedona,
Sit down.
please." I pulled out the chair opposite her. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to apologize for my presence. I was heading to the botanical preserve. I need to sketch some agaveperii for a commission. "You're an artist," she said, her eyes lighting up. "I knew it. You have that way of looking at things like you're trying to memorize the exact shade of the shadow." "I'm an illustrator," I corrected, feeling a flush of heat in my cheeks. "It's less about art and more about accuracy. Plants don't lie. They are exactly what they appear to be." "I wish people were like that," Angela sighed, leaning back. "In my world, everyone is a politician. My father's company is a legacy, and every time I step onto a flight line, I'm being measured against 40 years of his reputation. People see the girl in the jumpsuit and they either see a princess or a mistake. Nobody sees just me." We sat in silence for a moment, but it wasn't the prickly, defensive silence from the morning. It was a shared quiet. I watched a sparrow hop across the cobblestones, and I realized I wasn't anxious. I wasn't looking for an exit. "Why do you travel alone?" she asked. "Because I'm bad at being a person," I said, the honesty surprising me. Socializing feels like a performance I haven't rehearsed for. Traveling alone is the only time I don't feel like I'm failing someone's expectations of how I should act. Angela reached across the table and tapped my hand. "Well, you didn't fail mine today. You were the best passenger I've ever had. You stayed calm when it mattered, and you let me do my job. That's more than most people can say." She pushed her map toward me. Look, I've been traveling for 5 years. I've been to places where the maps are just suggestions. I've learned a few tricks. How to tell if a guide is lying, how to secure a hotel room door with a chair, how to find the one person in a crowd who will actually help you if things get weird. You want to go to that preserve? Let's go. I'll carry the water, and you can show me how to see the world without a pressure gauge. The afternoon in the botanical preserve was a revelation. For 3 hours, I sat on a sun-warmed rock and sketched the intricate, geometric folds of the agave. Angela didn't hover. She didn't ask me what I was doing or tell me it looked pretty. She wandered the paths nearby, returning every 30 minutes to drop a fresh bottle of water or a piece of fruit next to my sketchbook. She was giving me the space I needed, but she was also making sure I was taken care of. It was a balance I hadn't known was possible. As the shadows lengthened, we sat on a bench overlooking a canyon of saguaro cacti. The air was cooling again, that desert chill returning. I almost didn't go today, Angela said, her voice barely a whisper. I've been burnt out for months. My dad wants me to take over the safety inspection division, which means I never fly. I'd just spend my life in an office, signing off on other people's risks. I came here to decide if I was going to quit entirely. And? I asked. And when that valve blew, I didn't think about the office. I didn't think about my dad. I just thought about you and the pilot and the fact that I knew how to fix it. I realized I don't want to stop flying. I just want to stop flying for him. I looked at my sketch, the sharp, defensive thorns of the plant, designed to protect the soft, water-rich heart inside. I think we're both good at protecting ourselves, I said. I use silence. You use noise. But today, we both had to let that go. I think you're right, she said. She turned to look at me, her expression serious. Chloe, I know you like your solitude. I really do. But would you want to grab dinner tonight? No pressure. We can sit in complete silence if you want. But I'd like to have one meal where I'm not the pilot and you're not the illustrator. Just two people who didn't die today. I felt the familiar tug of my anxiety, the urge to say I was tired, that I'd work to do. But I looked at the scratch on her cheek, the badge of her courage, and I nodded. I'd like that, I said. But I get to pick the place. Somewhere with no music and very few people.
Deal, she laughed.
That dinner was the longest conversation I'd had with a stranger in a decade. We talked about our families, my overprotective mother who didn't understand why I wouldn't just work in a library, her father who saw her as a corporate asset. We talked about the fear of being seen and the greater fear of being invisible. By the time the check came, I realized I hadn't checked the time once. I hadn't looked for the nearest exit. I was just there. The final day in Sedona arrived with a bittersweet weight. I was at the gate of the tiny regional airport, waiting for my flight back to Seattle. I had my headphones on, but no music was playing. They were just my usual defense mechanism against the terminal's noise. I was thinking about Angela. We had exchanged numbers, but a part of me, the cynical, anxious part, assumed that once the adrenaline wore off, we would become just another vacation story. A you had to be there moment that would fade into a Christmas card once a year. Excuse me, is this seat taken? I looked up. My heart did a strange, happy somersault. Angela was standing there, her yellow windbreaker tied around her waist, carrying a massive backpack. Angela, what are you doing here? I thought you were staying for another week. I was, she said, dropping into the seat next to me. But I called my dad last night. I told him I wasn't taking the job. I'm moving my things out of the company housing and finding my own place. I figured, why wait? Plus, I have a friend who lives in Seattle who might need some help with her exposure therapy. I stared at her. You live in Seattle? Born and raised, she grinned. My dad's firm is based in Tacoma, but I have a studio apartment in Capitol Hill. I'm in Queen and, I said, the coincidence feeling like a physical shock. On 4th Avenue. Wait. Angela's eyes widened. The brick building with the green awnings? Across from the bakery? Yes. She started to laugh, a deep, soulful sound that drew looks from the other passengers. Chloe, I live on 6th. I walk past your building every single morning to get my coffee. I've probably seen you 100 times and never realized it was you. The flight home was different from any I'd ever taken. We didn't talk the whole time. We both slept, exhausted from the previous 48 hours. But when I woke up and saw her head tilted back against the seat, her hand resting near mine on the armrest, I felt a strange sense of belonging. It wasn't the quiet I was used to, but it was a piece I hadn't known I was missing. When we landed in the gray, drizzly familiar embrace of Seattle, The transition didn't feel as lonely as usual. We stood at the baggage carousel, watching the suitcases tumble out. "So," Angela said, hoisting her pack. "See you at the bakery tomorrow morning? 8 o'clock. I looked at her. The woman who had held me in a falling basket, the woman who had seen my terror and didn't judge it. 8 o'clock, I said. "But I'm warning you, I'm not a morning person." "I know," she winked. "I'll bring the extra-large coffee." Being back in Seattle meant the return of the real world, but the world felt different now. I spent my days in my studio, the walls lined with sketches of Sedona plants, but the silence no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a workspace. Angela and I fell into a rhythm. We met at the bakery 3 times a week. I learned that her sunny exterior was a skill she had honed to survive the male-dominated world of aviation, a way to be likable so she wouldn't be called difficult. I learned that she was a brilliant mechanic, someone who could listen to an engine and tell you exactly which bolt was loose. 3 weeks after our return, I arrived at the bakery to find Angela staring at her laptop, her face pale. The sunny mask was gone. "What happened?" I asked, sitting down. "My dad," she said, her voice tight. "He's blocking my certification transfer to the independent cargo company I applied to. He's telling everyone in the industry that I'm unstable after the Sedona incident. He's using the equipment failure, the thing I fixed, as proof that I can't handle the pressure." My blood boiled. It was a cold, sharp anger I hadn't felt in years. I thought of her leaning out of that basket, the silver multi-tool in her hand, saving the lives of 3 people. "He can't do that," I said. "He's doing it. And because I was just a passenger on the manifest, there's no official record of my role in the recovery. The pilot's report is vague. It just says mechanical failure resolved." I remembered my camera. "Angela," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. "I didn't just take pictures of the rocks. When the turbulence hit, I didn't turn my camera off. It was around my neck, and the shutter button got jammed against the floor. I thought it was ruined, but I checked the memory card last night. I opened my bag and pulled out my tablet. I swiped through the photos. Most were blurs of wicker and sand. But there were 4 shots, clear, sharp, high-resolution images of Angela. One showed her reaching for the bypass valve, the grit and determination on her face unmistakable. Another showed her hands deep in the burner assembly, the multi-tool clearly visible. The final one was a shot of her holding me, her eyes fixed on the pilot, directing him. "This is evidence," I said. "This isn't an unstable passenger. This is a pilot in command." Angela stared at the images, her eyes filling with tears. "You caught it. Chloe, you caught the moment I became myself." "I'm an illustrator," I reminded her, a small smile playing on my lips. "I'm trained to observe the details that everyone else misses. And I'm not going to let him erase you." The next week was a whirlwind of activity that should have terrified me. We had to file a formal appeal with the aviation board. It required meetings, phone calls, and the most daunting part for me, a formal statement in a room full of strangers. Normally, I would have retreated. I would have told Angela I was sorry, but I couldn't do it. But every time I felt the panic rising, I remembered her draping that shawl over my shoulders. I remembered her using her body as a shield for mine. On the day of the hearing, I wore my best blazer. My hands were shaking, but I had my tablet in my bag. Angela was standing in the hallway of the regional office, looking more nervous than I had ever seen her. "I can't believe we're doing this," she whispered. "We're just telling the truth," I said. "And the truth is exactly what it appears to be. Remember?" Inside the room, 3 men sat behind a long mahogany table. Angela's father was there, too, a tall, imposing man who radiated an aura of absolute authority. He didn't even look at her. He looked at me with a patronizing pity that made my spine turn to steel. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't look at the board. I looked at Angela. I told them about the private tour, the glitch, and the moment the sky broke. I told them about the hiss of the gas and the pilot's paralysis. "And then," I said, my voice gaining strength, "this woman saved us. She didn't just help. She commanded the situation. She diagnosed a failure that the pilot couldn't see, and she fixed it while the basket was dragging through the air." I pulled out the tablet and laid it on the table. I swiped through the photos, explaining the technical details Angela had taught me over coffee, the bypass valve, the manual vent, the redundant line. "These aren't just photos," I said, looking directly at Angela's father. "This is a record of a pilot who deserves to fly. If you block her certification, you aren't protecting the industry. You're depriving it of its best asset." The room was silent. I could feel the shift in the air, the same shift that happens when a storm passes and the sun comes out. The board members leaned in, studying the images. Angela's father looked at the screen, his face unreadable, but I saw his hand tremble slightly as he saw the image of his daughter, fierce and capable, in the face of death. We won. The board not only cleared her certification but issued a formal commendation for her actions. When we walked out of that building, the Seattle rain felt like a celebration. Angela grabbed my hands and spun me around, a jubilant, uninhibited laugh echoing through the plaza. "You did it, Chloe. You actually stood up in a room full of suits and stared them down." "No," I said, catching my breath. "We did it. You gave me the story. I just provided the illustrations." Success for Angela meant she was suddenly busier than ever. She was hired by the cargo firm and started flying routes up to Alaska. I was proud of her, but the old familiar fear started to creep back in. Now that she was fixed, would she still need the girl who was bad at being a person? I was facing my own crisis. My botanical illustrations had caught the attention of a major gallery in Pioneer Square. They wanted to do a solo exhibition of my Sedona series. It was everything I had worked for, but it came with a terrifying price, an opening night gala where I would be expected to talk about my work to a crowd of donors and critics. I spent the week leading up to the show in a state of near collapse. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I thought about the artist's talk, my lungs felt like they were filling with sand. The night of the opening, I stood in the back of the gallery, hidden behind a large potted palm. I was wearing a silk dress that felt like a costume. The room was filling with people, clinking glasses, loud laughter, the smell of expensive perfume. It was my worst nightmare. "You're hiding," a voice said. I looked up. Angela was there. She wasn't in a jumpsuit or a yellow windbreaker. She was wearing a sleek, professional suit, her hair styled in a way that made her look like the commander she was. "I can't do it, Angela," I whispered. "I'm going to go to the bathroom and climb out the window." "I'm serious." "Chloe, look at me." She stepped into my space, just like she had in the balloon. "Look at the walls. Look at what you did." I looked. The gallery was filled with my sketches. The agave perii, the saguaro, the prickly pear. They looked magnificent, strong, intricate, and deeply alive. "You see those thorns?" Angela pointed to a sketch of a barrel cactus. "You think that plant is bad at being a plant because it has a defense mechanism?
No.
It's a survivor. It's beautiful because it knows how to protect itself. You aren't bad at being a person, Chloe. You're just a person who needs a little more wicker around her than most. And that's okay." "But I have to speak," I said, my voice trembling. "No, you don't have to speak," she said. "You just have to tell them what you saw. And if you get scared, look at the back of the room. I'll be standing right by the door. If you give me the signal, a tug on your ear, I'll set off the fire alarm and we can make a run for it." I laughed, a genuine, shaky sound. "You'd really do that?" "In a heartbeat. But you won't need me to, because you're the woman who stared down the aviation board. A few art critics are nothing compared to that." I stood at the small podium, the microphone a cold, silver eye staring at me. The crowd went quiet. I felt the familiar rush of panic, the urge to disappear. My vision blurred. Then I looked at the back of the room. Angela was there. She wasn't smiling her sunny smile. She was just standing there, her arms crossed, her gaze steady and grounding. She was the anchor. I took a breath. I didn't think about the people. I thought about the plants. When I went to Sedona, I began, my voice clear over the speakers. I went looking for silence. I thought that to be an artist, I had to be alone. I thought that my anxiety was a wall that kept the world out. I paused, my eyes meeting Angela's. But I learned that sometimes the most important things are only visible when you're forced to share your space. I learned that strength isn't just about surviving the storm. It's about who is standing next to you when the sky starts to fall. These illustrations aren't just about plants. They're about the resilience of things that grow in harsh places and the unexpected ways we find to protect one another. I talked for 10 minutes. I didn't stumble. I didn't look at my notes. When I finished, the applause was warm and genuine, but I barely heard it. I was busy watching Angela. She gave me a single, sharp nod, the same nod she'd given the pilot after we landed in the sand. The rest of the evening was a blur of handshakes and compliments. I handled it. I stayed. I didn't climb out the window. At the end of the night, when the last guest had left and the gallery owner was locking the doors, Angela and I walked out into the cool Seattle night. We walked toward the bakery, our footsteps echoing on the damp pavement. "No fire alarm?" she teased. "Not tonight," I said. "I think I'm getting better at the being a person thing." "You were always good at it, Chloe. You just needed a witness." 6 months have passed since Sedona. My life hasn't fundamentally changed. I still prefer the company of plants to large parties, and I still get nervous when my phone rings. But the fortress is gone. In its place is something more like a home. Angela and I still meet at the bakery. She's flying cargo 3 days a week, and I'm working on a new series of illustrations for a textbook. We don't talk about redemption or healing. We talk about the weather, her flight schedules, and the best way to keep a fiddly fig alive in a Seattle winter. But the bond is there, woven into the fabric of our daily lives. It's in the way she knows to bring me coffee without me asking. It's in the way I know when she's had a hard day by the specific way she ties her windbreaker. It's a girls help girls pact that doesn't need a formal agreement. Yesterday, we went back to the park where we first realized we were neighbors. We sat on the same bench, watching the sunset turn the Space Needle into a silhouette of purple and gold. "You know," Angela said, leaning back and closing her eyes, "sometimes I miss the desert. I miss that specific shade of red."
"I don't," I said.
"I like the gray here. It makes the green pop." She laughed and nudged my shoulder with hers. "Always the illustrator." "Always the pilot," I replied. I looked at her, my friend, my protector, my witness. I realized that the glitch in the booking system was the greatest luck I'd ever had. It had forced me out of my solitude and into a connection that had changed the trajectory of my life. It had taught me that vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's the bridge we build to reach each other. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small gift, a new multi-tool engraved with her name and a tiny, stylized agave leaf. I handed it to her without a word. She looked at it, her fingers tracing the engraving. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She just clipped it to her belt, stood up, and offered me her hand. "Ready to go home, Chloe?" "Ready," I said, taking her hand. We walked back toward our respective streets, 2 women shaped by the sky, grounded by each other, moving forward into the quiet, beautiful mess of the real world. We were no longer afraid of being seen because we finally knew what it felt like to be truly watched over.